I'm making a story-driven, real-time, tactics-based digital card game. In this video, I'd like to talk about one of the most important aspects that's gone into it so far, which is the game design. Let's take it from the top. The name of the game is Summoner's Nexus. Now, getting to that name took a lot of workshopping. I called it Heart of the Cards, I called it Heart of the Summoner, but I eventually just decided to go with the name of the story that the game is based on, since it's based on a fantasy book that I had already written. I just decided to merge the two. Since the game is story driven and everything in the game is at least loosely based on the book, it made sense to go with the same title. Now, the gameplay. As for the gameplay, well, you summon these beautiful creatures called avatars, and to put it simply, you bludgeon your opponent with them until they stop moving. The they there could be your opponent or the avatars, actually, now that I think about it. You'll play against other people, ideally, but you'll also play against AI piloting the spirits of various decks in the story mode and the training mode. I want to break down everything that's gone into the game in sort of like a dedicated devlog series, and like I've already said, this video is going to focus on game design. Let's start with the idea. So I first got the idea for Summoner's Nexus in the middle of the night one summer when I was tossing and turning in bed and I couldn't sleep. You see, I had been working on a webtoon called Heart of the Cards, which was effectively a Yu-Gi-Oh fan project. I had original characters in this newly imagined setting going on this magical adventure, and most importantly, the characters in that game would play Yu-Gi-Oh as one of the defining factors of how the power system worked, effectively. It was supposed to be similar to the show, and so similar to the show, I reinvented a reason why these children's card games were deciding the fate of the world and why everything hung in the balance, and we were off to the races, at first, anyway. You see, the more time went by, the more concerned I was about the fact that I had invested all of these resources, this effort, this time into a project that used intellectual property that I didn't own. I didn't have permission to use it either. The Yu-Gi-Oh license, Konami, all of those companies who own it, I didn't have the permission to do what I was doing. And while I thought that if I just kept it small, I would fly under the radar, I didn't want to keep it small at that point anymore. Like, so much had gone into it. I had built an entire universe and I wanted to do something with it. After having spent probably around a year working on this project, I wanted it to be as big as it could. And yes, there was this built-in audience that came with having the series based around Yu-Gi-Oh, because people who like Yu-Gi-Oh would come and check out my series, but I didn't think that it was worth what I would be giving up, right? The crutch of riding on someone else's coattails, effectively, in a creative sense, what I gained by having that built-in audience wasn't as much as what I would be potentially giving up from a creative standpoint. So in the middle of the night, I called my girlfriend at the time at 3 a.m. I'm sure she probably still remembers, and I announced that I wasn't going to be having the characters play Yu-Gi-Oh anymore. It wasn't going to be a Yu-Gi-Oh fan series. I was going to take the plunge and make something original. I don't think I slept that night. I honestly do not remember because it was just a blur. My mind started racing at 1,000 miles a minute, and yeah, I just got to work immediately. I technically wasn't started from scratch though, because I decided to pull from a project that I'd been working on way back when I was in college called Kato Wars. It was a series that I had just been envisioning that also involved card games. I've been into card games for a long time. And so I used that as a foundation for what I then ended up building into Summoner's Nexus. I had created an original card game for that series as well. I say created, I never finished the series, so I never finished the game, but there were some loose mechanics that were in place, and so I used that as the backbone of what I then transformed into the new game. So let's talk mechanics. Now, this game's mechanics are almost entirely based on lore, right? I knew based on the existing template that I had from the old game and some of the moments of the story that I wanted to happen, that the game would need to involve monsters moving around on a game board, because if they were stationary, what I was envisioning just wouldn't work. So that was how the movement system became a thing. In the original draft, there was a diamond-shaped board that the monsters moved around on, trying to make it to the other side. I ended up scrapping the shape, and there was a good reason for it, I just don't remember what it was. Right, I scrapped it because it was just too convoluted. With all of the other mechanics that got added on later, moving one by one across a bunch of squares across a diamond board, it was just too much. And so I scrapped the shape, but I kept the sole objective, which is making it to the other end. So that starts us off with two straight lines, right? We have my line that I use to move across to come and hit you, and your line that you move across to come and hit me. Simple, straightforward. That's the original foundation that we started working off of. But there was a problem. That's all offense, right? We've got two lines. They only go like that. And as a result of that, I can't protect myself. You can't protect yourself. So if I send something to come and hit you, it's guaranteed to hit you. There was no real room to like improvise or innovate. And so whoever sent more bigger monsters out quickly would be the most likely person to win. So we had to change that. Well, if the objective of this game is to reduce my opponent's Nexus gauge to 0, I think it stands to reason that my secondary objective is to prevent my Nexus gauge from being reduced. And so I created a landing hub of sorts, right? A defensive zone that sits between you and your opponent's monsters when they come to attack you, where if you have something stationed, it can protect you. And now all of a sudden we have interaction, right? It's not a guarantee that when they attack me, the attack gets through. Perfect. Now we have a system in the game where you can disrupt or interrupt your opponent's strategy of, trying to kill you. And we have interaction in the game between the players. That's great, but the options and choices that you have are still very limited. Attack or defend. The mechanics of the game were almost set in stone in that since there are only two things that a card will ever do, attack or defend, the game sort of made the choice for the player as to what they do with their cards. If a card has weighted attack, you use it for offense. If it has weighted defense, you use it for defense. And there isn't really much flexibility. Yes, you interact with your opponent's strategy by blocking their attacks, but that's about all you could do. It made it kind of obvious who was going to win as soon as certain cards hit the field, because it's like, all right, well, this can only do this, so I guess this is what we're about to see. To introduce more counterplay, I went for a less conventional option and I introduced a counter zone, a dedicated place where you could send your offensive cards where instead of just attacking, they can defend you. It was an extra option that the player now had to disrupt the flow of the game, right? If I have an aggressive card, I can still send that to my opponent to go hit them over the head with it. Or if I see that they have a card coming my way, I can put it in the counter zone and intercept their attack before it reaches me. Now you have just even more options on how you want to play the cards, and every card can be used in a different way. I made it so that you couldn't spam monsters, like you couldn't summon 20 monsters in your counter zone at once, right? You can only do it once per turn. That way defending doesn't become too powerful of a position, because I was worried that if I made it so that you could defend too well, that would just become what the game was all about. So I made it sort of weighted between the appeal of offense and defense. And just like that, we had the basic design elements for the board of Summoner's Nexus, right? The only thing that was missing, because there's still more to come, was the casting zone, right? I wanted to have magic cards like most other TCGs have to an extent, and so the casting zone needed to be put on the board. I decided to avoid it getting in the way of anything, to just put it behind the defense zone, and that's how we had the structure of the board done. Something was missing though. I have attack-oriented cards and defense-oriented cards, and that's all good and fine, but what if I wanted to do something else? What if I wanted something that was more supportive, something that was more technical, that didn't fit neatly into offense or defense? Well, with the way the board is set up, if I send it out on offense, it's going to have to crash into my opponents, and if it's set on defense, then my opponent's going to crash into it before I can use my supportive capabilities. To solve this problem, I invented the Nexus, the safe zone in the middle of the board that prevents anything other than a support type avatar from being summoned there. That way all of the support type avatars could just chill and, not have to worry about being destroyed unless your opponent specifically invests resources to take them out. I feel like it's worth explaining that part of the reason why the support zone was so necessary is that support type avatars don't have high stats, right? Because having such disruptive effects, I felt like it needed to be balanced around something, so their stats were nerfed. Meaning that if a card is a support type avatar and you put it in the defense zone, it probably has 0 defense, which means it's going to get taken out. And a rule had been introduced that if a card is summoned as an attacker, it has to attack eventually, and if you have 0 attack, then you will just be destroyed on impact. There are ways around that from a technical perspective, but it just made things a bit more technical and complicated to expect the player to navigate that in a way that I didn't want to introduce. I'm all fine with technicalities and complications, but in specific and controlled ways, right? So that's why the safe zone was born. That's why it was necessary. I also really liked the fact that introducing the safe zone in this way gave you even more options for how you could play and interact with your opponent, because now your attackers couldn't just go to your opponent's defense zone. Now they could also enter the Nexus. They would have to sacrifice themselves as part of that process, but then you as the player get to make a choice as to how you would like to use your resources. And I feel like one of the things that makes games the most fun is consistent decision making and choices is being presented to the player. So that was really, really good. That was my main focus. I had already created the game on the basis of the Nexus being this shared energy source between the players based on the lore, and the graveyard actually occupied the space on the board that the Nexus currently does, again, based on the lore. I made this change and sort of revamped the concept of the Nexus so that it doesn't just revolve around death, because in the lore the Nexus is sort of a shared energy source that all things are born from, but also where all things go when they die. Now it emphasizes and focuses more on the life aspect than the death aspect, and the graveyard was just moved somewhere else. With that, the mechanics and layout of the game were created. I knew that card effects and a battle system would need to be introduced eventually, but that's where the base mechanics of the game sort of laid flat. That's where they ended, and so that's where we'll end here. I'll cover the more advanced mechanics in a future devlog, but I'm gonna go get back to development for the time being. If you enjoyed this video, if you enjoyed seeing just sort of a little bit of what went into the creation of Summoner's Nexus, consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, helps us out, and it helps you stay tuned with updates on the development of the game as we keep moving forward. So, with that being said, thank you very much. I don't know if I said that already. Goodbye.